We're living in a time when social media has become an echo chamber where meaningful dialogue is often drowned out by noise. That's why we're launching a new channel on Big Nerve, a new social platform designed to reward clarity, curiosity, and especially critical thinking. On Big Nerve, you can share your favorite conspiracy theory or preferred hypothesis or provocative question. But the real value from going there comes from what happens next when you and the other skeptics on the platform debunk the conspiracy, or you challenge the hypothesis, or you debate the question with substance. And here's the kicker. Every comment can be rated by other people on the platform as insightful or not. And each month, our partners at Big Nerve will reward $1,000 in prize money to the most upvoted comments. That is, to those who engage with reason, originality, and intellectual honesty. Seriously, there's no strings attached. $1,000 a month, and you can keep your winnings. Or you could donate them to the Skeptic Society, but no, keep your winnings. To get started, go to skeptic.bignerve.com. That's skeptic.bignerve.com. All right, everybody, it's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, as always, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Rebecca Lemov, is a historian of science at Harvard University and has been a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute. Her research explores data, technology, and the history of human and behavioral sciences. She's the author of Database of Dreams, The Lost Quest to Catalog Humanity. That is how scientists between 1942 and 1963 attempted to map the elusive and subjective parts of the human psyche via once futuristic data storage techniques. You can only imagine. That must have been like magnetic tapes or something.
Exactly.
World is laboratory, experiments with mice, mazes, and men. I'll have to tell you about my experiences working for 2 years in a Skinnerian lab with pigeons and rats.
Oh, yeah.
And co-author of How Reason Almost Lost Its Mind, The Strange Career of Cold War Rationality, all of which I'm interested in. But her new book is The Instability of Truth, Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyper-Persuasion. There it is. It's also available on audio. I've listened to it 1.5 times, Rebecca. It's a great book.
So glad you're enjoying it. Did you listen both times?
Well, I have the book, so I've been kind of skimming around, taking some notes. But yeah, I mainly listen to it when I'm out riding my bike or walking with the dog or doing errands or driving and that sort of thing. But I've read all these books on mind control, cults, and persuasion, and all that stuff. This is really the best kind of overall summary of the whole history of the phenomenon. But before we get into all that, maybe just tell us your story. What's your trajectory into this from your background?
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, and thanks for having me on your show. So my trajectory is that I guess I went into graduate school, having a background as in English literature in college, and I thought I'd really like to do something more in the world. And it seemed, not that I don't love reading epic poetry, or if I went to graduate school, I thought I really want to study something meaningful and meaningful to me, and that really asks, the biggest questions I could think of. So I kind of made my way into anthropology, or I was living in California. I decided to study anthropology, but then I ended up not quite doing field work, but thinking that anthropology would equip me to study the scientists themselves who had asked questions about human freedom. How free are we really? What are the things, how rational we assume we are? Is that actually the case? And also, to what extent are we shaped by factors that we just take for granted as, oh, that's just the way it is, our culture, or even just things we take to be trivial, but how much of what we take to be ourselves is really us. So I ended up writing a history of behaviorism, which it sounds like you have direct experience in as well. I was interested in these great ambitious plans during the Cold War especially, but even in the earlier periods of behaviorists, to create a kind of science of human control and maybe human engineering. And then at the end of my dissertation, I wrote a chapter on brainwashing, because brainwashing seemed like it posed these questions in an especially urgent way. And I also thought what could be more out of date and seemingly irrelevant than this thing called brainwashing or mind control? Because at the time I was writing in the late 1990s, it really had fallen out of favor. It seemed just like a relic of an earlier moment of hysteria, and it couldn't possibly have anything to do with our present or future. So it seemed like the most out of date. And I've always had a soft spot for ideas that have fallen out of favor. So I ended up taking that kernel of brainwashing that was left over from the dissertation and teaching classes on it for the last couple decades, and eventually and writing about it in different ways. And now then I thought a few years ago I should actually put it all together in a book if I can, but I'm not sure anyone will be interested because it didn't yet seem very urgent.
Nice. Yes. Well, it's a fascinating history. I've had a number of authors on the show about books about MK Ultra and
Mm,
CIA mind control and all that stuff. It's so interesting. And, this whole like Tom O'Neill's Chaos, which was just made into a Netflix documentary series,
mhm.
I think, was Manson part of the whole CIA, MK Ultra mind control? How did he get those young women to commit murder when he wasn't even there, and so
Yeah.
on and so forth? There does seem to still be a mystery that's
Mhm.
unsolved. Namely, how do you get people to do things that
Yeah.
on the surface they would not normally do?
Yeah, I agree. There does seem to be a mystery. And I don't think maybe people growing up today necessarily know the story of Manson or the fact that he didn't actually commit the murders, but yet people acted as if they were extensions of his will. But also, the evidence is they felt, or they spoke of how they said, certainly he may be a prophet, and I'm following in his footsteps, but I may be a prophet too. So his followers were strangely not simply robotic, but also seemed to be empowered in some way or enjoying themselves, it's very strange to even contemplate. So and every time I've taught the class on brainwashing at my university, students do seem to, at least they usually seem like they have just a question. What is this? Or is this a how-to class? Or what is even the question at the heart of this?
Yeah, I guess at some level they're probably asking themselves, would I fall for something like that?
Hmm.
It's like when you show the Milgram shock experiment stuff, they're thinking, I would never do this.
Yeah,
uh,
very few people immediately identify that they would. They know they would. And if
yeah.
they do, either they're being brave or, I don't know. Yeah, it's just really rare. I know one writer said that she knew she would have delivered shocks. But it poses the same kind of question, the Milgram experiments. What would I do? Are there situations where, it's also the fascination with cult documentaries and stories of elaborate financial scams. We always want to reassure ourselves that we wouldn't take part, or we wouldn't fall for that, or we wouldn't do that.
Have you ever fallen for anything like that? Any personal experiences that made you interested in this topic?
Yeah, I have many from the, uh, I guess there's the one I mentioned in the book is just the experience in graduate school of kind of falling into a circle of so there's sort of intellectual level, and then there's deeply personal levels, and then there's seemingly trivial levels. But on the intellectual level, during graduate school, I kind of I fell into a crowd of scholars, and my dissertation advisor was well known he was quite famous for his relationship with Michel Foucault, and I learned a lot from learning from him. But these kind of post-structuralist theorists that were in vogue at the time at UC Berkeley, I just was in a circle where people were reading them as if they were these fragments of sacred texts. And they would be, I was falling into this too. Like, I thought if I could just read these they were very hard to understand. So you would take them home and you puzzle over what could this Jacques Lacan have meant here, and bring it back to the group, and people would disagree. I remember a moment seeing I was meeting with my advisor, and a graduate student ran in or just a professor I was taking a class with, and he ran in brandishing one of these books and waving it around like like he was intoxicated. And he said, "It is not about truth; it is about love." And then she yelled back, "No, it is about truth." And he said, "No, love." And it was like a movie. It was very funny, and but I don't suppose they saw it quite. You get carried away, and anyway, as it relates to myself, I wrote a paper for which I received a lot of praise. It seemed at the very edge of being understandable, yet maybe profound, and I eventually got it published. But some friend of mine who was a journalist read it, and he said, "I don't even recognize your writing here. I don't know, like, who is this? Who is this person writing?" He said that it just seemed not like me and not really completely understandable, as he was kind of a stickler for uh, not necessarily easy writing, but writing that you could really get to the bottom of. So anyway, that was a little bit of a wake-up call where I saw that, at certain moments you can get carried away. You can become distant from maybe yourself. And, you know, and, the more personal part that happened around the same time was just that I fell into a kind of coercively controlling relationship that had to do with drug addiction, somewhat because of I think I felt at the time that I disappointed my family, and I basically wanted to check out, and I thought I can handle this. This will just be a little bit. I'll just take a few steps in this direction, and it turned into a couple of years of just a very painful experience where the deeper I got into it, the less I was able to get out. And I lost perspective on it. I really thought I no longer deserved, to maybe even survive this addiction and this relationship where I constantly felt that I wasn't measuring up to the standards this person was constantly illuminating. So just having, I guess, one thing that added to my research and just the fortune of getting out of that difficult situation gave me a lot of insight into, on the personal level. It reminded me recently, my daughter took a class on the poetry, the literature of Dante, and he, at the beginning of his great work, he talks about how in the middle of our life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood, the right road lost. And I thought, wow, I mean, and for Dante, apparently middle of our life's journey was your late 20s or early 30s. And, so I did find myself at this lost, and the right road lost. And to have that experience made me wonder, how can we, how does that happen?
Really fascinating. Was this
Yeah.
this was a romantic relationship, I presume, and how
Mhm.
did you get out of that?
Well, I was just very fortunate that, because as is often the case in these kind of, I don't want to just say bad relationships, you go in thinking it's fine, and then you lose touch with friends, you lose touch with family, and you lose relationships through which you can test the sanity of it. And so I was kind of lost in this for a time, and I happened to have a coffee date with one of my few remaining friends. This is kind of funny, but I mean, I feel so grateful to her, my friend Nikki. Anyway, I went out for coffee with her, and she just said, "This person, he acts like he's better looking, smarter, and much funnier than you, but he's none of those things." And somehow it was like this wake up call that this wasn't the only reality. It was the reality this person had painted, and also my capacities were diminished by the kind of the effects of drugs as well. So just
Mm.
having somebody else's perspective was useful.
Yeah, reality check is super important, which is one reason why one of the characteristics of cults is they get you to leave your family or
Hmm.
disconnect from your friends and colleagues or anybody that could give you a reality check who might say, are you sure this is the right thing to do?
Sometimes
at,
even
at
children,
coffee. Mm.
control over one's children is very, I shall say, effective or malevolent aspect of abusive cults is that you have to surrender your biological children supposedly for their own good, but it creates a lot of control, guilt, and emotional attachment.
Yeah, the drug use, that's interesting because that's one of the things Manson did with
Mm.
the young women was, they did a lot of LSD, as you wrote about in your book, and other drugs, and also a lot of sex. I don't think you need MK Ultra mind control technology to explain Manson's influence over these followers of his. I think, just good old human nature and how people react that way in response to those sorts of things
Mm.
explains a lot. As you were talking, I was thinking of, is postmodernism in that sense a kind of a cult?
Mm.
Not really a cult, but, so, along the lines of what you're talking about, you fall into a worldview in which everybody is kind of steeped in the language. And the language of postmodernism, which I try to read those things, and it's a little bit like in UFO circles. We have a thing called low information zone,
Mm.
or you could apply this to Bigfoot or whatever. That the photos are always kind of grainy, blurry. You can't quite make out what's going on, and that's where people kick in. Well, see, if you kind of use your imagination and squint, you can sort of see right there. It's like I don't really see that, but that's where the imagination then kind of fits in. Maybe this kind of intentional obscurantism of that kind of writing is meant to do that, to make it a low information zone, so that therefore you can fill in the blanks however you want.
Or you're sort of elaborately instructed in how one should be filling in those blanks or at least the direction one should be going. But it also reminds me, there is an obscurantism in many beautiful things like poetry.
Mm.
And, who would want to deny themselves the ability to read into, or to, a poem shouldn't tell you what it means. It should allow the reader to find those things. So, but I think it can be abused. So I guess I found, now with several decades behind me, I find that I can appreciate some of these writings. Some of them I like still, some of them I don't like. It's sort of like poets I like, poets I don't like, but it's more in that framework. And I can also see that at some moments they could definitely become instruments of a kind of not a nefarious. I wouldn't call it. You could say a kind of social circle where maybe it didn't lead to really interesting work necessarily. A lot of mimicry and kind of hyper policing of each other's behavior, thoughts a little bit. That could happen.
Yeah. From this relationship you were in, then let's extrapolate to talking about why people stay in abusive relationships at all. Or, we just had the Diddy trial,
Mm.
where in his defense, his attorneys were saying, well, look, here's the text where she's saying, oh, I can't wait to freak off with you this weekend. So, I mean, why is she doing that? Why is she even saying that if she's, under his control and influence and threat and so on?
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. I suppose if I hadn't been through this relationship myself in the past of, no, I think I think that worked very much against the, it it didn't work in trial. I mean, the fact that there was a lot of evidence, or in the words of the women themselves, that they seemed to be enthusiastic participants in their own abuse, and that could then be portrayed as, well, this young woman just liked sex. Good for her. That's what the defense attorney, Mark Anifilo, who also
Hmm.
defended Keith Raniere,
Hmm.
he was quite successful in this case because, people say, well, they were grown women. This is just something they were choosing. And I do have, so it's tricky when you're in a legal context to make these things stick. And I think the history really shows that questions of mind control, brainwashing, coercive control are very difficult to litigate in court. And that's why they often have to to make use of RICO and racketeering charges and other types of financial improprieties, which often accompany sexual abuse. But personally speaking, I could relate to the women. I mean, I remember for years constantly flattering my uh, boyfriend because it was this way that the relationship was set up that he was great. He was just so great. And maybe one day the world would recognize how great he was. But I could provide a constant stream of like reinforcement for him. Oh, you haven't written your dissertation yet, but when you do, it's going to be awesome. And he could at the same time provide a constant stream of denigration to me. So that's kind of the bargain we had. And looking back on it, I could think for years about why that happened. What was it? It's provided a lot of opportunity for insight, and it never went to the level of me having to prove this in court. But if, because there was ultimately no crime, it was just it was a lot of suffering. And I feel a lot
Well,
of compassion for the women.
yeah, for sure. Well, there's a couple of other phenomena: loss aversion and sunk cost
Mm,
fallacy, where you're this far down the relationship. I hate to give up now. Maybe
mm.
it'll work out. It's hard to cut your losses and get out, like in investments or whatever, and it's hard in relationships in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, then they're just, I think people who do end up leaving abusive cults do describe a kind of moment. Sometimes they go on for years, and then, surprisingly, there's just a break, or they sometimes describe it as snapping, where the whole system of belief suddenly shatters. And it can be through maybe an accident, or a shocking encounter with an old friend, or seeing a family member. Or actually, this is a great example. I was being interviewed by a cult therapist who's worked for decades with cult members, and she was saying she has a client who was in QAnon, and he had been a kind of a just a mainstream Democrat for many years, and then had fallen into this QAnon circle and gotten really pulled in during COVID. And he was then joining demonstrations. He was in Times Square, and he was he was yelling in the street that something like Hillary Clinton needed to be arrested and shot. And then he turned and saw himself in the window of a building, a mirrored building. So he saw himself, and he thought, "Who is that madman jumping up and down?" Um, and he realized it was himself, and that was the shocking moment of self-recognition. But those kind of shocks can occur, and many coercive groups, coercively controlling groups, have ammunition that they then provide that you should apply when shocked. So they'll tell you to repeat certain words over and over again, or reassure yourself, or know that anyone who challenges you has to be uh, evil, or or various. There are various techniques.
Don't have mirrors in your cult rooms.
Avoid
Who is
mirrors.
that madman? Oh, it's me.
Not ma-
Yeah, well, the Keith Raniere Nexium thing is interesting because you don't surely did not start off as a cult. And in fact, I'm fond of saying no one in the history of the world has ever joined a cult. They join a group that they think is going to be really good. We're going to help the
Mhm.
poor. I mean, you look at Jim Jones, migrated from Indiana to San Francisco Bay Area in the 60s, one of the first to integrate a
Oh.
church instead of just being all white or all black. It was both. And, there's pictures of him with Jerry Brown, Governor Jerry Brown, in his first round as governor of California. That's very innovative and, very progressive. We're going to man the soup kitchens. We're going to help poor people. This is all good. Who would not want to join a helpful group like that? And then 20 years later, you're in Guyana. Okay. So it's a kind of a gradual, slow, 15 volts at a time kind of escalation game that happens there. But this brings to mind a deeper question I have. This relates to what Danny Kahneman called base rate neglect. That is, you say, here's this interesting phenomenon. Here's, the 15 women that joined Nexium, and they had their his initials branded in their crotch or something like that. And so we focus on that. But what's the base rate? How many women joined Nexium as a kind of self-help, empowering women in business group? Maybe it's hundreds or thousands or whatever, and they got 15 of them, or like that Netflix series, The Tinder Swindler. They had 4 women that they kind of focused on that fell for this guy and wired him tens of thousands of dollars and so on. But how many women did he try it out on? They don't mention that. What's the base rate? I mean, is it 4 out of 1,000, 4 out of 100, 4 out of 40? I don't know. And so how do we think about that?
Well, in the case of Nexium, that's a great question to ask. And I think that's one reason why there is no absolute list of abusive cults, because many people skate along on the periphery of what is, by almost all accounts, a dangerous cult, but they're not harmed by it because maybe they didn't get that involved, or they didn't go live in the compound, or they just took yoga classes once a week or something like that. So it's hard to say, but I did have a very illuminating interview with Sarah Edmondson, who is one of the women, one of the 15, she was one of the first to be branded on her leg, and actually she's a fascinating person. And she said herself she was happy they didn't go all in, because they never went to live in Albany in the compound, and she and her husband, so they maintained for themselves some arena of autonomy. She worries what would have happened if things had, could have been worse. But she did say at the moment she was receiving the brand on her body, they were laughing and they were saying, if somebody walked in right now, they might think we're in a cult, but haha, obviously we're not. So it's so interesting how capable we are in incredible duress. And she said she's had years of therapy to deal with that. But, just looking back at that moment, or to hold up a mirror in a sense for herself to try to understand how that could have happened. So, yeah, but the question of base rate neglect is also an important one, because it's almost every group, not everyone is exposed to the most extreme. And also it happens step by step in a slow manner. So certain people might gravitate to different, echelons of the group, and some people might be enthusiastic, or sometimes people draw back for a number of years and then they get more involved later.
Yeah, like how many people have taken the little personality test of Scientology,
Hmm.
or they're down on Sunset or Hollywood Boulevard, and they have the little uh, table set up there with the cans, and you can do the little e-meter thing. Big fun. I mean, probably tens of thousands of people have done it and just walked away. And how many actually take out a second mortgage on their home and give it to the church? Not many. So this. Okay, here's the larger picture for me. I mean, I've spent 30 plus years here at Skeptic magazine debunking all manner of weird things that people believe. So it just seems like people are incredibly irrational. But I've been kind of rethinking it in the last couple of years. Hugo Mercier's book, what's it? Not Born Yesterday.
Hmm.
Argues that we're not that irrational. Most of the time, most people maintain a fairly rational life. They maintain a job, a family, a marriage, they have kids, gas in the tank, food in the fridge. They go about their lives, and maybe there's just one quirky thing. They went to the January 6th thing in Washington D.C. and they did I don't know what I was thinking, but otherwise, or like the guy that went to the ping pong pizzeria in Washington D.C., Edgar Welch,
Hmm.
to break up the pedophile ring that, QAnon told him was, going on there. And, there's a kind of an underlying rationality. If you really believe there was a pedophile ring and crime and no one was doing anything about it, people do not infrequently take the law into their own hands when there's an injustice. So you could kind of see then he gets there and like, oh, and then he shoots his gun into the roof. He gets arrested. He spends a couple of years in jail and comes out and goes, I don't know what I was thinking. That was just crazy.
Hmm.
Otherwise, perfectly normal. Or there was that woman in Texas we found for this Netflix series I worked on Brainwashing, where she went down the QAnon rabbit hole. And she was otherwise married with kids, attractive, ran her own PR business. I forget her name now, but she talked us through the whole thing. And this is what I did, with the COVID shutdown. I just spent all day online reading all the QAnon stuff. And before you know it, and then she plays on her phone the voicemail her husband left her. I'm taking the kids and leaving you if you don't dump this QAnon craziness. And she said, it came down to this choice. This is the most important thing I will ever have an opportunity to do. I can save the country myself, or just be a normal mom, wife, and yeah,
Hmm.
that's boring. And then eventually she went back and had her moment of revelation there. But still, it's like, wow, okay, this could happen to anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is why there are several stories of researchers going to study something like the Flat Earth Society or QAnon and actually getting converted because it's not you think that would never happen, but actually you do come to sympathize with the rationality that's being displayed there because often there is a kind of rigorous step following. There's a kind of logic to it. I actually, for whatever reason, I feel like interested in the logical trains people follow to get to a certain point of view. So I'm constantly feeling that just it's almost like exercise. But I think one of the points I'm trying to draw out from my research is that what we think of as rationality is or reason is often undergirded or is always undergirded by emotion. There is an identification first, and then the rationality or the reasoning can kind of unfold. And that is supported by even the Enlightenment scholars like David Hume, who talk about how our passions they are that our reason is only ever a slave to what we're convicted by our passions, our emotions.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite quotes.
Hmm.
What he's saying there is that that reason and rationality is the best tool we have for achieving our goals. But what goals you pick,
Hmm.
most people, we're not rational about that. I'm a conservative or I'm a liberal because, well, I don't know. These are my people. This is kind of what I vibe with them. But if you ask me, I'm going to go, well, okay, I'll tell you the 6 reasons why I'm a conservative. I believe in freedom and religion and faith and family,
Hmm.
whatever. I'll give you
Yeah.
reasons after the fact.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, that reminds me also of one of my favorite passages from Max Weber, where he says, in Science as a Vocation, he says, science can tell you the answer to almost everything, how to, what to eat. I mean, just extrapolating, he says it can give you in exactitude many answers, but it can never answer the one question that is important to us. Uh, what am I going to do and how am I to live? So it can give you the surrounding calculations and not just exactitude, but actually rational reasons. But it can't answer the questions that he said, I think, divide every human heart or something like that,
Mhm.
that pull at our hearts.
Yeah, it'd be like trying to make a list of why I love my wife. Well, give me the 6 reasons or whatever. The real answer should be I just do. That's it, full stop. Because if I say, well, she's really good looking, she's a 9 on a scale of 10. Well, what if you met a 10? Would you leave her? Like, well, no, because that's not the reason in the first place.
Yeah, it's really
So,
true.
I mean, that's kind of a rational irrationalities. Other examples of this is, I don't want to know the outcome of the game because I recorded it. So, I choose to remain ignorant so I
Mhm.
can, later watch it. Or the sign on the Brinks truck that has the money, the driver does not know the combination to the safe, right? So the lack of knowledge is actually better for you to not know things, right? So there's kind of a rational ignorance in a way. But
And
yeah,
yeah, I think that's frequently the case with military operations, right? Because of, to go back to what at the beginning of my book, you talk about the POWs. I mean, what they can actually know should they be captured is often a
right,
consideration
right.
because anyone under torture will eventually, I mean, it's pretty much anyone if the conditions are applied, will give up the information they have. So it's better if they simply don't know.
I mean, this is the ultimate argument against torture or enhanced interrogation or whatever, because you're not getting accurate intelligence.
Mhm.
People are just going to say whatever they have to say to get you to stop, including confessing crimes, right? I mean, back in the witch trials, yes, I am a witch, or he's a witch, whatever. Just whatever it takes to stop turning the rack further.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a significant part of brainwashing. I don't think it's this exactly the same, but it's does seem to be a huge part of especially the generating, incidents, episodes that cause brainwashing to come into the English language. There's a significant amount of torture, just the question of what people will do and say when they find themselves in an impossible situation, a very painful situation. the types of confessions they'll attempt. Like some interesting in your chapter you sent me, there was a mention of Robert J. Lifton and his
Mm.
book on the Nazi doctors, and of course he's famous too for being one of the first, or he wrote one of the most significant books about thought reform. And some of the cases he describes are so eloquent, so interesting. For example, this French doctor who's caught. He had been living in China as a physician, and he didn't want to leave, even though people said when the communists came in, it's probably wise for you to go back to France. But he sent his family back, but he stayed himself. And once he was arrested and subjected to intensive to thought reform, he was kept in chains and not allowed to any autonomy, personally. But and then these long interrogations, he wasn't allowed to sleep. He couldn't even eat, or when he had to relieve himself, like other prisoners had to unzip him, his pants, or he had to eat off of the floor like a dog, and all these, and he has just had these very painful chains. So he says, after a while, you just tell yourself, I have to get rid of the chains. I have to get rid of these chains. And so when they ask him to confess to being a spy, initially his response is to say, once he, into a week or so into it, he says, I was a great spy. I did all these, he does these sort of grandiose confession. And they say, no, we won't accept that. We know that's not true. We know you're guilty, but that's not acceptable, that type of confession. It has to be an empirically grounded confession. And he realizes that it's almost like they collaborate in the next several weeks, or actually it turns out a couple of years, to create a seemingly realistic account of all of his actions as he was living in China, who he spoke to, who he met on June 2nd, 1951, and they had a conversation about the price of tea in China, or the how shoes were in short supply, or petrol was difficult to find, or things like that. And he has to convince himself that he really was acting as a spy. From a certain point of view, it's not sufficient just to make up a confession to save himself the pain. He actually has to come to believe it himself, to the satisfaction of the authorities, for him to be exonerated and ultimately released.
Yeah, that and the other stories that you tell in the book, particularly like Patty Hearst. I was thinking about Bob Triver's theory of deception and self-deception.
Hmm.
That we evolved a deception detection device, as it were, or neural
Mhm.
network or whatever, because we know people lie. So it's good to have some cues to look for if you think somebody's going to cheat you out of something or lie to you, because we're a social primate species. We have to get along, and so on. But it's kind of a game theoretic analysis. So Bob's theory is that it's not enough to deceive people because they may detect it. You won't give off the cues that they may detect if you believe the lie yourself.
Mm.
And so you just, to really convince other people, you just start really believing it. So I think a lot of cult leaders or, psychics who talk to the dead or astrologers or whatever. I think a lot of them are just messing around, having fun, just trying it out. Yeah, I'll try doing a psychic reading, or I'll try some astrology, readings just for fun. And then they start to get good at it. And then the more they actually believe, maybe I do have these powers. And then they get more positive feedback from the people they're interacting with. And that makes them, think even more, I can really do this.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe Patty Hearst, at some point, she just think I really have to convince these people. So I'm just going to believe their ideology or whatever, something along those lines in the course of weeks or months.
Yeah, I think she said later in an interview after her release, she said to Larry King, by the time they were done with me, I really was a soldier in the Symbionese Liberation Army. I mean, because she had decided at some point in her captivity and under these extenuating, horrendous conditions, being held in a closet in the dark for 59 days, not being allowed to even see, being blindfolded, not being allowed any autonomy, uh, multiply raped, exposed to propaganda, all these things. She said once she decided she did want to live, she had to accommodate her thoughts to coincide with theirs. And it wasn't enough because they kept saying, "You're not brainwashed, are you?" They wanted to find those cues that she was lying. So, and they're, not, they're highly sensitive to that. It's a major thing in the group's life as well. So she had to actually convert herself. And I think that's one thing that came up in the trial I noticed is that the experts, including Robert J. Lifton, but especially Louis Jolyon West and others, they wanted to insist that she had never been converted. But I think she actually did have to convert herself. It's just that conversion, we mistake it, in my opinion, for something permanent, whereas it has to be perpetually renewed. And that's why Patty Hearst isn't today a Symbionese liberation. I mean, she just went through a terrible experience.
Yeah. Well, but I think the way we think about it is that it's got to be black and white. You're either this or that, and
Mm,
that's that. Well, but life is just not like that. I mean, we have a
yeah.
set of relatively permanent personality characteristics, like in the openness to experience or introversion, extroversion, conscientiousness, and so on. But there's a lot of variation there, and it does change throughout the lifetime a little bit. So people are a lot more flexible, I think, than we realize. And again, you have to, so back to your original where you start the book with the Korean prisoners of war. And what did you call it? The volleyball problem.
Yeah.
Look, they're playing volleyball. They must be having fun. They must really love this. Well, what else are you going to do? You're captured. You got to kind of go along. And then maybe at some point you think, yeah, this communism thing, this is a really good idea. Maybe this would be good for America or something like that. And you end up saying some idiotic statement that you later regret.
I suppose, too, also what I was struck by is in the volleyball, the photos that came out of the POWs playing volleyball in some sand pit, and some of them looked a little chunky, like they'd gained weight. And people commented in the US, "Oh, they've put on some weight. They can't possibly have starved. They can't possibly have been maltreated. They can't possibly have been tortured." But all of those things had happened. They just weren't immediately evident, and it wasn't legible in these pictures. And it's interesting how readily we do succumb to, I guess, visual evidence, but also, these types of arguments. In a sense, it's an argument that what we can know, what we can know of somebody. And I thought also striking as I studied these materials over years is that the POWs returning from Korea, the ones who did return, as opposed to the 21 who decided to go to China, the ones who came back on a ship, they ended up writing a poem together, which is captured in a scholarly article. And they basically said, no one will ever understand. Uh, they said, yes, we were badly wounded, badly treated, but what does it mean to you? You'll never, in other words, people will never understand what we went through that extracted this seemingly strange, freakish behavior of, us doing false confessions or quoting communist propaganda. And this turned out to be the case. They weren't understood. And the same is true of Patty Hearst, who said, I despaired of anyone believing or understanding my experience. And that turned out to be true to this day. I think many people still find it impossible to believe what happened to her and that impossible to trust that she wasn't just somehow on there's this whole wild ride theory that she actually was enjoying what was happening. And it's kind of a volleyball problem
Mm-hmm.
attributed to Patty Hearst.
Yeah, the famous picture in the bank with her hat and the rifle and all that. Yeah, it's hard. You look at that and go, well, come on.
Yeah. And the prosecuting lawyer said her movements on the videotape taken by the Hibernia Bank, that she looked so agile. She was moving so quickly. She couldn't possibly have been brainwashed. She couldn't have possibly have been under their control because she was so alert. But she had to make herself so. So it's
Yeah, I just again the term brainwashing, mind control, it's not accurate for the way the mind actually works. It's an idea that you document went on for half a century that we think this is what is possible. It's really not that possible.
it depends how you define it, I suppose.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think it's not possible in the way people think, but it's a useful, I guess I like I'm now in the field of history of science, and we do. I mean, what's interesting is how people have how the word has flourished and how many things get attached to it, and personally, I think it's interesting to use as a window for self-reflection. What do we think it means? I think it is possible for people to be deeply changed by their experiences, sometimes in radical ways. I mean, I've certainly seen that. And you can come up with maybe more neuroscientifically accurate accounts or psychodynamically accurate or things like that. But I guess that's why I argue that it is real.
Yeah, it's real. I mean, for sure, people go down a rabbit hole and end up somewhere that they never would have anticipated. But it's not like the CIA can just take control of somebody and get them to assassinate the president or something like that. I guess that's. But let me just think about this out loud here. I mentioned, working in a Skinnerian lab.
Mm.
Uh, Remember when Skinner was experimenting with having pigeons in the nose cone of a missile, pecking
Yes.
at keys to make it, direct correctly. Now we have computers that do this. After 9/11, Richard Dawkins wrote I think it was in The Spectator, a brilliant op-ed about talking about Skinner's experiments and say, well, if only we could get, people to do this kind of thing. Well, there's no way we could get somebody. Well, I wonder if we could get somebody to like fly a plane into a building. Well, no, there's no way anybody would do that. And then of course his point is that religion does that. Religion can get people to do these sorts of things. So that brings to mind, the difference between a cult and a new religious movement and religion.
Mm.
How do you think about the kind of the spectrum of different beliefs there?
I think it's a really rich territory. I'll come back to that. Just one small comment on the
Oh yeah.
I can't resist because I teach sections of about B.F. Skinner in my class, and I
Hmm.
love to teach the operation. I don't know if he called it Operation Pigeon, but the part you're describing where he actually trained pigeons to guide missiles during World War II and around 1942, so that they could connect with a target. And he was successful. Uh, the military came in and toured his facility, and the pigeons, of course, would end up dying, but it would be, would be a worthy sacrifice as he saw it. So it was actually an interesting project because it actually worked, and radar had not yet been developed, but it was concurrently being developed. So it's just the fact that radar came in around that time. But there are interesting accounts of when high brass military came to tour his facility, and they were expecting this high-tech operation, and they saw the pigeons, and they just couldn't deal. It wasn't the image of that they wanted of a strong nation, able to prevail using the latest technology. It turned out to be just these homegrown birds that were actually quite I mean, the heroism of pigeons is a whole other story. So anyway, I always
That's
just find
funny.
that amazing that they rejected it, not because it didn't work, but because it didn't symbolically fit.
Interesting.
Then also radar then came along. So
All right. I did not know that. That's super interesting.
yeah, there's a wonderful article about this, but about religion. So, new religious movements is a really interesting area, and as well as the history of religion. And I just spent 2 weeks in Amsterdam at the University of Amsterdam in a course that was kind of about the history of. It was the history of human consciousness, psychedelic research, and also the history of religion because it was taught by religious studies scholars, and it really gave me some insight in a way into how they look at this terrain. I mean, I became interested in researching my book in these cult wars back in the 80s, in which religious studies scholars and religious historians took great issue with the cult research and the sociologists and psychiatrists who tended to focus on the really pathological groups that get a lot of attention, and as you're saying, they were focusing on the worst outcomes of those groups. And so these scholars were saying we need to look more broadly at the history of religion and see that the literal definition of cult is merely a small religious group. I mean, Christianity was a cult. It became this big, then it grew into a religion. This is kind of how things develop, and we've pathologized the very meaning of cult, and they thought that was very unfair too. That's why they came up with the term new religious movements to distance it. And so they started to also systematically take down the leading scholars of cult research, such as Margaret Singer, who had really developed these vibrant careers testifying in court about brainwashing and the dangers of cults. So anyway, I don't have an absolute answer. I think it's really profound. I mean, many profound questions are raised. Like you were bringing up the question of gurus and how they may come to believe their own hype. Like they get into astrology, they get into whatever it is, whatever. Maybe they're using meditation, chanting, group techniques. They're cultivating bonds among their followers. They're also cultivating their own magnetism and charisma. I think they do have these. I think that often, as part of meditation or part of these practices, they are having these, what do you call them, out of body or sort of altered states of consciousness that lead them to believe that they're somehow godlike. And then that leads them to believe that nothing they can do, that they're somehow beyond good and evil, or that whatever they do is righteous. And then the group their followers seem to reinforce that. And that's how a group can kind of pinwheel. So I think the territory is much less clear than we think, and it's much harder to easily demarcate, whether over time or within a group itself, what is pathological or even, we would have to say evil in something like the Jim Jones cult.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very spectrumy, and I think it depends very much on what actually happens in a group. Most of the time, nothing bad is particularly happening, but we focus on the negative things. It's a little bit like the demarcation problem between science and pseudoscience. Well, there's no single definition that's going to cover all specific cases. Scientology, for the most part, I think of it as pretty culty. But I've met Scientologists. I met Isaac Hayes, the great singer, songwriter, the voice of Chef on South Park and so on.
Mm.
He was at my best friend's Thanksgiving dinner. He's sitting right across from me for hours.
Mm.
Super nice guy. He had just had his career rejuvenated, and he was famously a Scientologist. So I, as kindly and respectfully as I could, what is it you get out of Scientology? And he said, well, Michael, I was at the pinnacle of, Hollywood, music, the whole thing. I had everything. And I just lost it all, basically sex, drugs, rock and roll, the whole thing, gone. And I was at the bottom of my life, and Scientology saved me. I'm like, okay. Yeah. I mean, and what am I going to say to that? Nothing. That's good. Right.
Yeah.
And more recently, Ayaan Hirsi Ali became a Christian. She was famously one of the new atheists, and now she's a Christian. What happened? Well, there's a lot of personal stuff. She said she's written about this now and spoken publicly about it, that, there was issues with alcoholism and drugs and suicidal ideation. She's lived under a death threat, the threat of being murdered since the 90s. She lives with 24-hour protection. I've done a number of public events with her, and I hardly ever see her. She's in the green room. There's guards at the door. I can't go in and see her. Right. And, she has to leave immediately afterwards. She doesn't get to go to the after party and have fun. She's with an armed guard because somebody will try to kill her. And then she, got married, had kids, and now she's afraid they'll kill her kids. And this led to this, understandable depression, anxiety. And, then it was Christianity that saved her. And when she tells me the story, it's like, okay, I don't want to talk you out of anything. I'm an atheist, but, life is hard. I can't imagine what it's like to live, under a death threat like that. It's in a way of saying, religion is good when it does good. It's bad when it does bad. It's a lot of different things. And, new religious movements are on the spectrum. They're just smaller, whatever. It just depends on what actually happens.
Yeah, I use that rubric in meditation, and I've heard it used. I do a lot of meditating, and I find that, you can have a range of experiences. These don't necessarily determine the quality or whether it's right, whether it's right for the person. It can actually be, anything can be abused, I guess, is what I've discovered in life. Even something that seems to be so positive and maybe society seems to be so optimistic about meditation or cold plunges or deep breathing or whatever it is. But for me, meditation's been a profound thing. But I think you do have to constantly check, a reality check. How is this affecting my life? Are my relationships better? Am I more compassionate generally? Is it shutting down, my, to certain capacities, and and whether it's actually helping me in my life. And I think even that can sometimes be misleading because initially people can have these amazing experiences, whatever, but you have to keep doing that as over time.
Yeah. I had Steve Hassan on the show. He wrote a book, The Cult of Donald Trump, or The Cult
Hmm.
of Trump, or whatever it was called. And, I like Steve, his work. I like him. He's got a great story. His bite model explains some things, I think. But 80 million Americans are in a cult? I mean, really? I mean, come on. This is using the term, I think, too broadly.
I agree. I mean, well, that's why if people want to pursue that question, I refer them to Steve's book. But I personally think what do you even say? I've heard other people say, okay, 60 million, 80 million, no, everyone who voted for Donald Trump is somehow in a cult or brainwashed. And then others will say, well, therefore they all need to be deprogrammed. I mean, this leads us down a hideous path. And it doesn't, that's why I kind of, I really try to think about brainwashing as to the extent it's a useful mode of inquiry or window, it's to look at oneself and to see that we're all connected. These things they don't happen as like an isolated phenomenon that somehow we just lost half the population or something. But we have nothing to do with that. It's a dynamic that our society is creating, and this is actually part of it. To imagine that it's just infected over there or something.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Milgram experiments in the larger context of explaining how you get normal civilized Germans to become goose stepping, exterminating Nazis. I've been long fascinated by this. Your discussion, I thought, was very insightful. That the real target here is the people delivering the shocks, and the real response is how uncomfortable we all are watching this unfold and kind of giggling or laughing or kind of squirming. The shocker, the person doing the shocks is squirming. It looks like they don't really want to do it, and we're uncomfortable watching it. What do you take from all that?
Yeah, I think these experiments are mysterious, and that's why people are they created a lot of discomfort in Stanley Milgram's life, and I think they have something to do with the fact that he never got tenure and had to leave Yale. Not that that's the worst thing that can happen to somebody, and he did have a flourishing career at a city college, I think, but yeah, but these experiments famously made people uncomfortable because it was hard to interpret them. Also, I think that there are people were uncomfortable. The people giving the shocks were uncomfortable. And even if you mention that over and over again, it somehow disappears from the telling. And when the final figures are given, oh, 2/3, administered lethal level shocks or thought they were, suddenly those people, their experiences erased, the discomfort or even agony they were feeling is erased. And suddenly they're real live Nazis or the Eichmann thesis has been proved. And the deeper you go into how the actual experiments were run, you find that Milgram and his graduate students were taking bets on how far people would go too. Like they kind of did treat it as a game sometimes that people would laugh while observing the experiments. But also I found over the years that students laugh in an uncomfortable way because and even in the one you conducted yourself with NBC, Dateline, in the guise of a reality TV show, you see a lot of pained laughter and wanting the people who did comply, who were compliant and who gave shocks, they want to be reassured. They are laughing too. They want to know, oh, this is in the realm of humor. And I think what it is that you've just been, um, it's hard for them to find a foothold from which to describe what just happened to them. And they've been, in a sense, tortured, but it's hard to recognize. It's hard for anyone to recognize, and it only results mostly in the experimenter seeming to have the power of interpreting what's just happened. Anyway, so I try to give a new lens to these experiments, which I do find so interesting just because you can keep looking at them and find more in them. And there's actually a scholar who wrote me from the UK. I'm forgetting his name right now, but he's coming out with a book shortly, studying what you know how Milgram himself described these priming conditions that were, he's doing a close study of almost like an ethnographic study of what happened in the laboratory.
Oh, interesting. He's treating it like the subjects were primed to do something
Or
rather than the agentic explanation Milgram offered.
I think he's actually, yeah, I think he's actually talking about binding conditions or something like that. I just started to read it. It's fascinating, but he seemed to find it, I mean, I think there is something to do. Milgram was not, to my knowledge, people didn't take that seriously, his agentic
Mm.
shift, but I think there's also something going on there.
Yeah, I mentioned working in that Skinnerian lab for 2 years. That was under Douglas Navrick, who got his PhD under Douglas Fantino at UC San Diego, got his PhD under Bernstein at
Mm.
Harvard,
Oh.
and then there's the connection to Skinner. All right, so Doug wrote several papers reinterpreting Milgram. He treated it as a approach avoidance conflict, and that you have reinforcement and then you have punishment, and you kind of go back and forth, like the rat that gets rewarded for going onto the plate
Mhm.
where the cheese is, but then gets a little shocked, so he doesn't want to go, but he wants to go. He doesn't want to go. He wants to go. That was his interpretation. You want to obey the authority. Here's a famous scientist at Yale University, or in our case, here's NBC Studios. I want to be part of this reality show. That would be cool. But on the other hand, I have to do this uncomfortable thing. So I want it. I don't want it.
Mm.
That kind of thing. I think there's just many different ways to interpret it because it is somewhat mysterious.
Mhm.
And, maybe there's just a variety of the way, different people respond differently. So they have different motivations. There's not a single theory that's going to explain it.
That's true, and, it's also quite amazing how generative it has been of so many theories. So many people have things to say about it, from "This is the root of all evil" to "This proves that everyone is completely situational in there. There's no
Yeah.
evil. No one could
Yeah.
ever be evil." But I think, what you were saying about approach avoidance is kind of interesting. It brought to mind something like the Catch-22 situation, or Gregory Bateson, his schismogenesis, just like situations that can actually drive someone insane because you're being punished for the very thing you're being incentivized to seek. Uh, I mean, so that's when used in child rearing, it has terrible results. So perhaps,
Yeah.
it sets up a very difficult situation. And the whole story of how Milgram came to the experiment is also pretty interesting.
I don't think you wrote about Zimbardo in your book, did you?
No.
Look under, because it's a similar situation. He and Milgram were colleagues and of the
Hmm.
same age, essentially trying to explain the same thing. They're both Jewish. Like, how did this happen to our people? And we're scientists. Let's explain it. You know, uh, Toward the end of his life, Phil came under heavy criticism that he coached the prisoner, the randomly chosen students who played guards a little too much, and that they were therefore just doing what he told them to do, not this is the role I'm adopting now.
Hmm.
I think that's an overly criticism, but I'd like to get your thoughts on that because, in a way, he is studying how prisons operate, and how would an undergraduate Stanford University student have any idea how a prison operates? So you have to kind of give them some instructions. This is what you're supposed to do, and then they kind of take over. Like the mirrored sunglasses. He told me he got that idea from that film Cool Hand Luke, where the prison guard wore those mirrored sunglasses because it dehumanizes you, makes a disconnect between you and the victim. That kind of thing. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's another such a rich experiment. That's why I love teaching it as well, just because there's so much there. And the deeper you go, the more, because now the participants in the experiment, many of them have been interviewed and reflected on it over many decades. So the guy who played John Wayne, who did come up with those mirrored sunglasses, I think he did say that but this was his own, in a sense, he showed an unusual amount of initiative in embodying and carrying out uh, Zimbardo's instructions. So when Marvels, this guy went on to become something like a insurance adjuster, just, some guy, later fairly successful in life, but not very, not, he doesn't stand out as particularly certainly not evil as he seems in the film that he has a real taste uh harming people,
Hmm.
for really extracting obedience from these prisoners, or even torturing them in a sense. But he's just like, he doesn't seem to also have much reflective capacity. He just is a little bit proud of what he did. So it's been so interesting to see what's come out of it, some other people. But I think maybe the backlash against Philip Zimbardo has to do with the fact that people on some level felt uneasily as if he didn't accept responsibility in some way for
Mm.
what he had caused to happen. And maybe that's hard to even put into words, but there's almost an inchoate sense that he um, unleashed or set up this phenomena, and then he didn't fully describe his own role and also perhaps his responsibility for stopping it earlier.
Mm.
Because maybe it's even a discomfort with scientific experimentation with human beings at that level, where these undergraduates, who's to know what the lasting effects might have been. So
Mm.
maybe there's the backlash is not, it's not perfectly logical, but there's a sort of emotional sense that Zimbardo must have done something. Is there's like an uneasiness with it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that one guy that gave an interview a couple of years ago, he was interviewed decades ago, and he was saying very different things then than he is
Mm,
now. So I thought,
mm,
I don't know. Oh, I just went along with it because, Zimbardo told us to. It's like, that's not what you said 20 years ago.
right. Yeah.
So I don't know. There's some post hoc rationalization going on there. But to extrapolate it to real world situation like Christopher Browning's book Ordinary Men, also a great docudrama on, I think it's on Netflix, of the same title, Ordinary Men. How do you get these guys to do these things? They're actually killing Jews up close, boom, and they're uncomfortable doing it. They get shit faced every night. They have to move them to pits so that they're not quite so close, and so on. And you can't. You just wonder, is there some also self deception there? Like, I don't really want to do this, but then well, they are Jews, and we all know they're subhuman, and they're the ones that started this war. Remember, Hitler told us that. All the propaganda throughout all the 30s, the
Mm,
1930s, there was a lot of stuff that happened that had nothing to do with exterminating Jews. It was just a bunch of other stuff that kind of primed people to be able to do that at some point. But then you don't want to let them off the hook, like Hannah Arendt's, the banality of evil. I expected Eichmann to look like a monster, and he looked like an ordinary bureaucrat. But I thought she let him off the hook a little too much. He really was a rabid anti-Semite and worked mightily to exterminate as many Jews as he could. So there's somewhere in there, there's a complex explanation. I think. What are your thoughts?
yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the profound experiences of living in Berlin for a couple of years when I was at the Max Planck Institute, well, one year for each sabbatical, and there was a museum exhibit. I think probably around 2013 at the Central, National Museum in Berlin, and it was just the ordinary accoutrements of life under National Socialism. So it was things like a cute little chess table that had, the Nazi insignia swastikas, or like pot holders for the home with full, anti-Semitic like slogans. It just showed just the sheer ordinariness and the way that day-to-day life was kind of woven in if you were, I guess, sufficiently adherent. But you would just find these household items, and that it wasn't the usual chilling things like the photographs of emaciated people or gas chambers. It was actually just like oven mitts with swastikas. It's so interesting to see that, and it's good. It's a good reminder or something to really contemplate. On the one hand, and then with the ordinariness of someone like, then can you extend that as Arendt did so successfully? I mean, I think you can criticize her work, I suppose, but I think, you probably can, but I think what was successful about it is that she, in a sense, used Eichmann to make a broader point about there's something about the way she describes him. Um, Maybe she underestimates his rabidness, but the way she describes how his conscience, that passage in Eichmann in Jerusalem where she says his conscience worked for 2 hours and 53 minutes. There was one time where he saved one Jewish gardener
Mm,
from being exterminated, and then after that he never did anything else because he knew the man, and
mm.
he took some action, and so she said basically we saw his conscience operate for 2 hours and then it never
That's
was
funny.
seen again. But she's
Right.
having like she's because she's so talented, I guess. She's bringing forward this idea that has stuck with us, and perhaps it doesn't fully describe Eichmann himself, but more her interest in him, like
Yeah.
in that question. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. That's a good point. Yeah, you do wonder after the war, these people are all dead now, but how many of these Germans that did participate, and then they just go about their lives. Well, that was then. Now is now. It's different. I wouldn't do that now.
Mhm.
Something like that. Of course, with war crimes as a thing and genocide as an actual term that was coined in 1945. Now it's a thing. So we gotta put some people in the docket for this, or else this could happen again, and we don't want. All right, so yeah, so you get these trials like that guy Damunjunk who was worked for Ford Motor Company in Ohio for 40 years or whatever, and then okay, we're gonna bring this guy down. It's like, yeah, but that was a long time ago. I mean, that's not the guy he is now. But we have a hard time thinking of it like that.
Yeah. I think we do have trouble with history, with, the length, I guess just the human life, how we are changing. Like to think that people are just one thing all the time for your whole life on some level. Also, we have trouble with social bonds, the extent to which we actually are generated by our social environments and our deeply, embeddedness in those things. All those questions are just hard to reckon with, especially when practical, or even just maybe the sense that there needs to be a reckoning. There needs to be a public sense that we are vigilant against monsters,
Yeah.
and that it can't, so.
Well, the name of that film is it's a series Netflix, the Devil Next Door, I think it's called.
Mm.
It's like God. I was living next to this guy for all these years, and he was a Nazi guard at this concentration camp, and he herded Jews in the gas chambers. Wow. He was a quiet man.
Yeah.
Well, that's who he is now. He was somebody else in this other situation. Yeah, I mean, this goes back and forth. That was Phil's whole thing. It's at the Abu Ghraib soldier who was in charge of Abu Ghraib. I forget his name now. That Phil was on his defense team,
Mm.
saying, "Well, he's not like that when he was in America. He was a Boy Scout. He was the high school standout hero, and so on and so. He had all these decorations and stuff, and he's put in this bad situation. But then, where is free will? Where is your volition?
Yeah, where's responsibility? It's like a lot of people who do end up in cults and maybe do terrible things, like get involved in, or at least see and sanction and somehow stand by when the abuse of children is happening. Maybe they wouldn't have entered that cult if they hadn't walked down a certain street on a certain day and waited at a certain bus stop and happened to have met these recruiters and happened to have, maybe they just, all sorts of circumstances and happenstances may have resulted in their decision, and it was an ill-informed decision. Nonetheless, is there not a moment? Is there not responsibility? I think that's what's confusing. It is confusing, and when you get, maybe the legal context actually is illuminating in that way, that when it really push comes to shove, how does responsibility, how how will that function? Because ultimately, everyone has their reasons.
Yeah. Well, that was the fascinating thing about the Manson trial was Bugliosi had to get these women convicted for murder because they really did do it. But then also get Manson, who wasn't even
Mm.
there. So he must have had supreme brain mind control over these girls. But on the other hand, we don't want to let them off. Like, oh, I was just a victim of Charlie's mind control. So he concocted the story about the helter skelter and the race war and all that stuff that I think Tom O'Neill, I think he does debunk that is probably was not the real motive of the Manson family, helter
Uh,
skelter. I mean, but Bugliosi's goal was not to figure out what happened, the truth. His goal is to win the case, right? So lawyers operate differently than scientists in that sense.
Yes, I actually am going to be talking to Tom O'Neill shortly
Oh,
about some of these questions. And we probably cross paths a lot in the Lewis, Jolly, and West archives, but
mm,
I think one thing maybe that should be considered with the Manson family is the shift from not just intensive use of LSD, but then into amphetamine augmenting the LSD and creating like a different, I mean, as they progressed in their crimes. So, and that actually, I'm curious to hear. This is where there was an amphetamine research project going on in Haight-Ashbury, where Manson's family, I think, was a subject of them, or I'm trying to find out if that was the case. But yeah, there's some interesting connections there. I don't know. Yeah, I don't. I think they wanted to make a story. I think the family wanted to make a story that would somehow create more of an aura around their acts, perhaps.
oh, I love the book Chaos, and
Mm,
I read the whole thing. I watched him on Rogan for 3 hours. I watched you on
mm,
Rogan for a couple hours. That was great. This is all good
yeah.
stuff. But at the end of the book, he's basically says, "I really have no smoking gun. I can't prove the connection between Manson and the CIA, MK Ultra, and all that." It's like, damn, darn.
Well,
uh,
it's a tribute to him that he kind of ends up that way.
yeah, oh,
Yeah,
absolutely,
yeah,
totally. High integrity and honesty on his part as a good
yeah.
scholar. Um, Part of the problem is that it's such a bigger than life target, Manson. In the same way, a Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, conspiracy theorists have picked through every single person Lee Harvey Oswald ever met, any group he had any connection to whatsoever, and you could somehow tie it back to the CIA. If you have the back to Milgram's 6 degrees of separation, you can find links to between anybody and anything, almost anywhere if you look hard enough.
Well, we'll see what Tom O'Neill's next book comes up with,
Oh,
and
is he still working on this? I
I
don't, I don't.
believe he is. I'll
Okay.
find out more. I'm looking forward to just comparing notes.
Okay, last topic because I know you got to run.
Yeah.
I love that you brought up Norbert Elias's book,
Mm,
The Civilizing Process, in terms of how norms shift gradually over time. Elias's database were these books of etiquette and how people had to be instructed, how to blow your nose, how to, how to eat politely at the dinner table and, use your fork for this and use your knife for that. And, and when you're, sleeping next to somebody, don't do this or that. I mean, it just goes on and it's astonishing. I mean, our ancestors were just disgusting.
I don't know if that's the conclusion we're supposed to draw. Our ancestors, but it is stunning. Please, yeah, refrain from blowing your nose in the tablecloth when, or
Right.
you,
And then looking at it going, "Oh,
and
look at
that's
these
okay.
jewels I
Exactly.
have here." Yeah. But your larger point there is that these norms shift so slowly over a decadal or maybe even century long time frame. We don't even notice it. And we just don't do the things that these people did in the Middle
Mm.
Ages, and it never even occurs to us. You don't have to implement self-control because I really want to blow my nose into the tablecloth at my neighbor's house, but I'm just not going to do it because I have self-control. It never even enters my mind to do that.
Or we're not aware of that desire, because at first the etiquette manuals addressed all people, and then, or first the gentry, then it addressed a wider population, then it just addressed children, and then after a while it seemed to be so inculcated that you didn't have to tell anyone not to relieve themselves in the corner of the room, or to blow your nose into your into, into your hand while you're eating. But what's interesting is that Elias published this in 1939, I believe. So he's kind of in Germany as a Jewish sociologist, watching the rise of. I mean, I think in a way he's asking these questions with the concepts of sociogenesis and psychogenesis, like what can be removed, what is civilization. And it also reminds me of Czeslaw Milosz, who says, living in Warsaw during World War II, he said, I'm surrounded by people, basically these couples, families living their lives. Everyone tries to remain normal for as long as they can. Like, you're putting away money in your 401k. They don't have 401ks. But essentially that idea, you keep doing the things you do, you live the best you can. And then he said he saw how quickly it decayed, and soon people are copulating in the street. They're dying, next to me. You go out for a walk, and all of a sudden this veneer of reality shatters. And I think this profoundly shaped him, and probably that same thing was happening to Elias. That's why I like his work.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it as a commentary on his own time, but that does make sense. I was thinking of it in the larger context. I had Jean Twenge on the show for her book Generations. So
Mm.
her book is about how generations change. Like, I'm a baby boomer, and the way I think about the world is very different from, say, the Gen Z and my kid and so on. But you don't even notice it until somebody points it out, like Gene does with data. Like, here's the kind of songs that were popular in the 60s. Here's what's popular now, or names, or just, anything that's happening like that. So one of her data points that stuck out to me was the age of first pregnancy for women in my generation, baby boomers, was 19. And today it's 29. It's 10 years later. And instead of having 3 or 4 kids, you have 1, maybe 2. Okay. So I asked her, how did this happen? I mean, does anybody sit you down and go, okay, here's the deal. You're not going to get pregnant until you're 29. It's like, no, of course not. It's just that nobody is doing this. Everybody
Mm.
is in high school is going to college, and then everybody in college is going to go get a career, and then they're not going to get married till their 30s, and so on. This is just what everybody does. You don't even think about it.
Yeah, it's a powerful thing, but we don't see. I guess that's from. I really like Jean Twenge's work, or taking generations as a kind of a analytical frame, because it is profound. All that we don't see is so profound, and I think that's what I'm trying to do with brainwashing. Is it
Yeah.
just kind of a reminder of how much we take for granted?
Well, your last 2 chapters on social media and AI and all that stuff are profound because we're in the middle of it now, and we
Hmm.
really have no idea what the effects are going to be. Apparently, there's some really negative effects, as Gene and Jonathan Haidt and others have shown. But this too may pass. I mean, maybe, social media, it's only 2007 that the smartphone is introduced, and then Facebook and Instagram, all this stuff is pretty new compared to, books or whatever, newspapers back centuries.
Yeah, very true.
Impossible to know. I mean, I'm always interested in this, like, what's the future of moral progress? What are we doing now that our descendants will look back like we look back at slaveholders, or the way people treated women or Jews or blacks, and are appalled? What are we doing that they'll be appalled by us? Well, if I knew, I wouldn't do it. Right? But I don't know. Animal rights, maybe we shouldn't be eating
I
meat.
think that is a good guess. I think it's a good guess. I think I'm convinced by those who say, when historians look back, the immense cruelty of animal slaughter through factory farming, industrialized agriculture, will be the great, unseen. And there's the studies of just how these facilities are hidden from view and even from the workers themselves. Anyway, I have a whole
Yeah.
interest in that myself.
Oh, you do? Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right. Let's let you get on to your next project here. Here it is, The
Okay.
Instability of Truth. By the way, I love this cover because it's difficult to read, which is the point, right? It's like,
Yeah.
what am I reading here?
It's a little bit, yeah, exactly, unstable.
Brainwashing, mind control, and hyper-persuasion. Yes, indeed. Rebecca, thanks so much for your work. What are you working on next? What's the
Oh, my
future?
next year, I'm working on a project on psychedelics and brainwashing. So,
Oh, nice.
really thinking about the psychedelic renaissance, its positives and potential pitfalls.
Oh my God, that's great. Yeah, because microdosing and psychedelic therapies are now kind of in vogue.
Questions about suggestibility and what might happen. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be in the form of a comic book, but
Oh,
we'll
wow.
see.
Oh,
Yeah,
cool. That's good. Yeah, we didn't even get a chance to talk about hypnosis. Another one of these super interesting, difficult to explain mysteries, but it's real.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It was great to talk to you too.
All right. Thanks, Rebecca.
Okay, thanks, Michael.